People always assume cruelty looks loud, like shouting or slaps or public humiliation, but the most damaging cruelty is quiet, routine, and justified as normal, the kind that settles into a child's bones so early she doesn't even know she's been wounded. She just grows up believing she deserves less. And that was the kind of cruelty my mother practiced on me for as long as I can remember. Not because she hated children, not because she was evil, but because I was the wrong kind of child. I was born a daughter in a house where sons were considered proof of worth and daughters were treated like unfinished mistakes. And from the day I could understand words, I understood that my existence had disappointed her. My brothers arrived one after another like answers to prayers, celebrated loudly, photographed endlessly, excused endlessly, while I existed in the margins of the house like an afterthought that never quite went away. And my mother never hid it. She didn't beat me or starve me. She did something far more precise. She withheld warmth. She rationed kindness. She made affection something I had to earn but could never fully receive. When I was small, I watched her face soften when my brothers entered the room, watched how her voice changed pitch, how her hands became gentler, how patience appeared effortlessly for them and evaporated instantly for me. And when I asked why she was angry with me, she would sigh heavily and say she wasn't angry, she was just tired, or busy, or disappointed. And somehow those words cut deeper because they implied that the problem was me. I learned early not to cry in front of her because tears irritated her, not to ask for help because she would remind me that my brothers needed her more, not to expect praise because she believed praise made girls weak, and slowly, quietly, I became useful instead of loved. I cooked, I cleaned, I anticipated needs before they were spoken. I became the reliable one, the invisible one, the one who kept the house running while everyone else lived in it. And my mother accepted this arrangement as if it were natural law, never questioning why her daughter carried responsibilities that exhausted grown women, while her sons were allowed to drift freely through life like guests in their own home. When relatives visited, she spoke proudly of my brother's ambitions, their futures, their potential, while describing me as helpful, obedient, good with chores, as if that was the highest ceiling she could imagine for me. And when I dared to dream aloud, to mention education or independence or a life that didn't revolve around service, she would look at me with something close to annoyance and remind me that girls like me needed to be realistic. Over time, resentment settled into her voice whenever she spoke to me, a resentment that had nothing to do with my behavior and everything to do with what I represented, a reminder of a life she hadn't chosen, of expectations placed on her by a world that valued sons more than daughters, and instead of questioning that system, she handed its weight directly to me. By the time my brothers grew older, they had absorbed this imbalance so thoroughly that they barely noticed it. They took her sacrifices for granted. They assumed her patience was infinite. They assumed I would always be there to pick up what they dropped. And my mother accepted this too, excusing their absence, their selfishness, their gradual emotional withdrawal as normal stages of a man's life, while holding me to a standard of loyalty so absolute that any deviation felt like betrayal to her. Then, slowly, inevitably, life unfolded the way it often does. My brothers found opportunities elsewhere. They married, they moved away, they built lives that required distance, and one by one, they left. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just decisively. Phone calls grew shorter, visits became rare, promises to return turned into vague intentions, and my mother watched them go with pride mixed with denial, convinced their absence was temporary, convinced they would always come back when needed, convinced she had earned that devotion simply by giving birth to them. I watched, too, from the same position I had always occupied, quietly observing, quietly absorbing, knowing something she didn't want to admit, that when sons are raised to be centered, they rarely learn how to orbit back. When reality finally settled in, it didn't arrive as a dramatic moment, it arrived as silence, unanswered calls, holidays spent waiting, small aches ignored. And suddenly, my mother was alone in a house that had once revolved around her authority, and for the first time, she had to look directly at the person who had never left. That person was me. I was older by then, worn in ways she had never bothered to notice, carrying years of unacknowledged labor, emotional restraint, and quiet endurance. And when she needed help, she didn't apologize, she didn't soften, she simply expected it, reaching for me the same way she always had, as a resource rather than a child. And something inside me hesitated. Not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but out of exhaustion, because for the first time I understood clearly that I had a choice. I could leave like my brothers did. I could protect myself the way they had. I could finally choose distance. And part of me wanted to, not because I hated her, but because loving her had cost me so much. But another part of me, shaped by years of responsibility and empathy, stayed, and I took care of her, not with bitterness, not with calculation, but with a steadiness that surprised even me. I cooked, I cleaned, I managed her appointments, I listened to her complaints, I absorbed her frustrations. I became her anchor in a life that suddenly felt unstable. And as days turned into months, something shifted that neither of us had planned for. My mother began to notice details she had ignored for decades, the way I anticipated her needs without being asked, the way I stayed when no one else did, the way I never reminded her of the past even when it would have justified my anger, and confusion crept into her certainty. She started to compare. Quietly, at first, noticing who called and who didn't, who showed up and who sent excuses, who sacrificed and who stayed distant. And slowly, painfully, she began to confront a truth she had avoided her entire life, that the child she had dismissed was the one who remained, and the sons she had favored were nowhere to be found. The realization didn't arrive with immediate remorse. It came with discomfort, with irritability, with defensiveness, because accepting it meant acknowledging not just a mistake, but a lifetime of misplaced loyalty, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Still, something cracked, something subtle but irreversible, and for the first time, she looked at me not as a duty-bound extension of herself, but as a separate human being, one who had endured more than she had ever acknowledged. And as she moved through the house with quiet competence, carrying her burdens without complaint, a question she had never allowed herself to ask began to surface. Not spoken yet, not fully formed, but heavy with implication, and that question would eventually force her to confront everything she thought she knew about love, value, and the cost of realizing the truth too late. By the time my mother began to sense that something fundamental had shifted in her world, it was already too late to return to the comfort of denial, because denial only survives when reality cooperates, and reality had stopped cooperating completely. The house felt different to her now, quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful, heavier in a way she couldn't name. And although I moved through it the same way I always had, efficient, present, dependable, she started noticing the absence of other footsteps, the silence of phones that used to ring with promises, the way days stretched without interruption. And slowly, she began to understand that loneliness isn't the absence of people, it's the absence of priority. At first, she reacted the way she always had when confronted with discomfort, by criticizing me more sharply, by finding fault in small things, by reasserting authority in petty ways, because control had always been her shield, and if she could still control me, then she didn't have to face the truth about them. If dinner was late, it was my fault. If the house felt empty, it was because I wasn't cheerful enough. If her body ached, it was because I hadn't anticipated it soon enough. And for a while, I absorbed it all silently, not because it didn't hurt, but because I understood something she didn't, that her anger wasn't aimed at me, it was aimed at the realization creeping up behind her, the realization that the sons she had centered her life around had quietly decentered her from theirs. There were nights when she sat alone in the living room pretending to watch television while actually waiting for a call that didn't come. and I would pass by, offering tea, offering conversation, offering presents, and she would wave me away with irritation, not because she didn't want me there, but because my presence reminded her of who was absent. Still, dependence is a patient teacher, and slowly, subtly, it reshaped her habits. She started calling my name more often, asking for my opinion, checking if I was tired, noticing when I looked unwell. And each of these moments unsettled her because they contradicted the story she had told herself for decades, the story where sons were strength and daughters were obligation. The more she leaned on me, the harder it became to dismiss my value, and that tension made her restless. She would mention my brothers casually, defending them before I said a word, explaining their busy schedules, their responsibilities, their distance, as if she needed to convince herself more than me. And I listened without interruption, without correction, because I knew that the mind resists truths it isn't ready to face. Then came the first real crack, small but audible, the day she fell ill unexpectedly and needed help urgently, and I handled everything without hesitation: doctors, medication, finances, logistics, while my brothers sent brief messages full of concern but empty of action. I didn't comment on it, but she noticed. She noticed who was physically present, who stayed awake through the night, who learned her medications by heart, who put their own life on pause without complaint, and something in her expression shifted. Not gratitude yet, but confusion, the kind that arises when reality doesn't match belief. After she recovered, she became quieter, more observant, watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, as if she were finally seeing me clearly for the first time, not as a role, not as a responsibility, but as a person who had chosen to stay. That choice unsettled her deeply because it forced a comparison she had avoided her entire life, and once comparisons begin, they rarely stop. She started recalling moments from the past differently, conversations she had dismissed, sacrifices she had minimized, tears she had ignored, and memory, once unlocked, can be merciless. There were evenings when she tried to talk, starting sentences and abandoning them halfway, circling around apologies she didn't yet know how to form, because apologizing would require admitting not just one mistake, but a pattern, a worldview, a lifetime of biased affection. I sensed it too, the growing weight between us, the unspoken reckoning approaching, and I prepared myself quietly, not for confrontation, but for disappointment, because I had learned long ago not to expect transformation where accountability is required. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not dramatic, not loud, but devastating in its clarity. One afternoon, she overheard a conversation I was having on the phone, not about her, not about the past, but about my own future, about opportunities I had delayed, choices I had postponed, responsibilities I had carried for too long. And for the first time, she realized the full cost of my loyalty. She realized that while her sons had been building lives, I had been maintaining hers. While they had been praised for independence, I had been taken for granted for sacrifice. And that realization didn't inspire pride, it inspired shame, sharp and unfamiliar. That night, she asked me a question she had never asked before, not accusatory, not dismissive, but fragile. She asked if I ever resented her, and I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I knew the truth would change something permanently. When I finally spoke, I didn't accuse, I didn't list grievances. I simply said that resentment grows where acknowledgement is absent. And silence filled the room, thick and irreversible. She cried then, not softly, not gracefully, but with the kind of sobs that come from a lifetime of delayed awareness. And in that moment, the roles between us shifted completely. She wasn't the authority anymore, and I wasn't the overlooked child. We were two women sitting across from each other, one facing the consequences of her beliefs, the other deciding how much of herself she was still willing to give. My mother admitted, haltingly, painfully, that she had never wanted a daughter, that she had seen me as a reminder of limitation rather than possibility. And saying it out loud stripped the justification from it, exposing it as fear rather than truth. She admitted she had been wrong, not once, not occasionally, but consistently. And those words, the ones I had waited for without realizing it, landed heavier than I expected, because acknowledgement doesn't heal automatically. It only opens the door to something harder: choice. From that moment on, nothing between us could remain the same, because she could no longer pretend, and I could no longer carry the relationship on silence alone. And as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, both of us understood that care had turned into reckoning, and what came next would determine not just our relationship, but the meaning of everything we had endured. After my mother said the words she had avoided her entire life, after she admitted out loud that she had never wanted a daughter and that her blindness had cost her more than she was prepared to admit, the house did not suddenly feel lighter the way stories like to promise. It felt exposed, like a structure stripped of its walls, and for days afterward we moved around each other carefully, not arguing, not reconnecting, just existing in the aftermath of honesty. People think acknowledgement fixes things, but acknowledgement is only the removal of a lie, and once the lie is gone, everything it was hiding stands naked in the open, including anger, grief, regret, and responsibility. My mother tried, awkwardly at first, to be kinder, to soften her tone, to offer help instead of demands. But kindness practiced late feels unfamiliar to both the giver and the receiver, and I didn't know how to respond without suspicion. I had spent my entire life learning how to survive her disapproval, not how to accept her care, and that reversal was disorienting. She would ask if I had eaten, if I was tired, if I needed rest, and each question carried weight because each one implied a version of her that had never existed before, and I couldn't decide whether to grieve the lost years or protect myself from hoping too much now. Meanwhile, reality continued its quiet pressure. My brothers remained distant, excuses becoming thinner, visits postponed indefinitely, and my mother could no longer ignore the pattern because it was happening in real time, not memory. She started calling them more frequently, leaving messages, sending reminders of her health, her loneliness, her need, and their responses, when they came, were polite but detached, supportive in language but absent in action. And watching this unfold changed something fundamental in her posture. For the first time, she wasn't just disappointed, she was confused because the logic she had lived by her entire life had promised her something different. It had promised loyalty in exchange for favoritism, devotion in exchange for sacrifice, and reality was offering her indifference instead. I watched her wrestle with that contradiction quietly, and in doing so, I recognized something uncomfortable in myself, a strange calm, because part of me had always known this outcome, had always understood that love taught unevenly produces uneven returns. One evening, she asked me why I stayed, why I hadn't left like they did, and the question startled her as much as it startled me because it forced her to confront the possibility that my loyalty hadn't been obligation, it had been choice. I told her the truth, that I stayed because leaving wouldn't have made me free, it would have made me someone else, someone hardened by abandonment rather than strengthened by boundaries. And that answer shook her because it reframed everything she thought she knew about strength. In her world, strength had always been loud, male, distant, ambitious, and here I was embodying a form of strength she had dismissed as weakness for decades: quiet, steady, present. That realization did not sit easily with her because it challenged not just her treatment of me, but her entire understanding of value. As days passed, she began telling stories from her own childhood, stories she had never shared before about the expectations placed on her, the disappointment she had absorbed from her own mother, the lessons she had learned about survival in a world that measured women by what they produced rather than who they were. And I listened, not as an absolution, but as context. Understanding where harm comes from does not erase it, but it explains its shape, and I could finally see how her resentment had been inherited rather than invented. Still, inheritance does not equal innocence, and I did not rush to forgive simply because I understood. Then came the moment that tested everything we had built since her admission, the moment when my brothers, sensing something had changed, suddenly reappeared. Not physically, but strategically. They began calling again, expressing concern, hinting at visits, asking questions about finances, health, arrangements, and my mother, desperate for reassurance, leaned toward them instinctively, eager to believe in their return. I watched carefully as old patterns tried to reassert themselves, as her attention shifted, as she began minimizing my role again without realizing it, and this time, something inside me refused to shrink. When she asked me to rearrange my life to accommodate a visit that might not even happen, I said no, calmly, without anger, without explanation. And the silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever had. She looked at me then, really looked, and in that moment she understood that the daughter she had taken for granted was no longer a child willing to disappear for approval. That realization frightened her because it meant that her second chance came with conditions, and for the first time, she had to face the possibility that love was not something she could demand retroactively. That night she cried again, but differently, not from shock, but from loss. The loss of control, the loss of certainty, the loss of a narrative where she was always right. She asked if it was too late, not just for forgiveness, but for redemption. And I didn't answer immediately, because redemption is not a question, it's a practice. And I needed to see what she would choose when comfort and growth stood on opposite sides. As the house settled into another uneasy quiet, one truth became undeniable. This story was no longer about how she had treated me, it was about whether she was capable of becoming someone different now, and whether I was willing to stay long enough to find out. When my mother asked whether it was too late, she was really asking something else entirely. She was asking whether change still mattered once the damage had already shaped the outcome, and that question lingered between us long after the words themselves disappeared into the quiet of the house. From that point forward, nothing could be repaired with gestures alone, because gestures without consistency had been her language for years, and I had learned not to trust them. What followed was not a dramatic transformation, not an overnight awakening, but something slower and more uncomfortable, the daily work of unlearning entitlement and relearning humility. And for someone who had spent her life believing authority was permanent, that work was exhausting. She began to catch herself mid-sentence, correcting old habits, stopping herself from dismissing my opinions, asking instead of ordering, listening instead of assuming, and each small adjustment carried the weight of decades behind it. There were days she failed, days she slipped back into familiar tones, familiar expectations, and each time it happened, I didn't argue, I didn't explain, I simply stepped back, withdrew my energy, and that absence spoke louder than any confrontation ever had. Slowly, painfully, she learned that access to me was no longer automatic, that presence was earned now through respect rather than obligation. Meanwhile, my brother's promised visits never materialized, their calls grew sporadic again once they realized there were no immediate benefits to extract, and watching this unfold finally broke the last illusion my mother had been clinging to. She stopped defending them, stopped explaining them away, stopped pretending distance was temporary, and one evening, without prompting, she admitted something she had never allowed herself to admit before, that she had raised them to expect the world to bend toward them and had raised me to bend myself instead. Saying it out loud stripped it of its power, but it also forced her to sit with its consequences. For the first time, she thanked me. Not casually, not defensively, but with specificity, naming the sacrifices she had once ignored, acknowledging the years she had consumed without replenishing. And although gratitude cannot rewrite the past, it can redefine the future if it's sustained. I didn't respond with tears or relief. I responded with clarity, telling her that care would continue, but only alongside my own life, my own boundaries, my own choices, and that love without self-erasure was the only version I was willing to offer now. That boundary changed everything because it removed martyrdom from the equation and replaced it with balance. Over time, the house transformed, not into something joyful, but into something honest, a place where silence no longer hid resentment and presence no longer implied submission. My mother grew quieter, softer in a way that wasn't weakness, but acceptance. Acceptance of her mistakes, acceptance of her loneliness, acceptance that favoritism had not secured her future, and that the daughter she had once dismissed was now the one defining its terms. In caring for her, I did not reclaim my childhood, but I reclaimed myself, and that reclamation mattered more than any apology ever could. When people ask now how our story ends, I tell them it doesn't end with forgiveness or punishment. It ends with truth, with a woman forced to confront the cost of her beliefs, and another who learned that staying does not mean shrinking, that love does not require erasure, and that sometimes the greatest power a daughter can claim is the right to be seen fully, not as a consolation prize, not as a replacement, but as the one who was always there, choosing presence not because she was obligated to, but because she finally chose herself too.